The first one is this. Often I hear professionals say, well, why didn't you just say no? And this, of course, can be so many different experiences. Children, I've heard even in court, I've had judges shout at children and say, well, why didn't you say no? And the answer is the Broca's area. The Broca's area is responsible for our speech and language. And it's the Broca's area that actually goes offline when we feel threat. The Broca's area is part of our frontal lobe. So it's the area where there's just limited neural activity when we feel threat, because all our neural activity goes to our brainstem and our limbic area. And so actually what happens is we don't have the capacity to say no. We're frozen. We can't reply. There are so many people that have been assaulted and hurt who are told, why didn't you say no? And they go, why didn't I say no? What's wrong with me? Did I really want this to happen? Is there something wrong with me? And the answer is no. When we understand trauma, we understand a little bit about the brain, and we know that the Broca's area goes offline. It stops speech and language. You see, there's another accusation quite often, and that's, well, you didn't fight, did you? Why didn't you fight? Maybe you just consented because you didn't fight. And actually then we don't always understand that, again, there are some instinctive, primitive responses to feeling terrified. This is a quote from me, I think. Oh no, it's a quote from Porges here, Stephen Porges. We forget that some bodily reactions are reflexive and not voluntary. Immobilization in response to life threat is a common reflexive response shared with several other mammalian species. Our society treats people who don't fight or don't effectively mobilize as if there's something wrong with them. Instead, a polyvagal informed society would be saying, this really was the best neurobiologically adaptive response that you could have made. And it's fortunate that your body made that decision for you. If you had fought, you might be dead. You see, that's a trauma-informed response. That's an understanding of the impact of trauma on us as adults. That sometimes we think we will fight in a situation, but our primitive brain overrules us and makes sure that we don't, because it recognizes that we might die if we fight. And so we aren't able to fight. But people that aren't trauma-informed will say, well, you never fought, did you? You stayed, didn't you? And that's not a recognition of the physiological aspect of the threat response. You see, too many people go, you've made bad choices. Well, sometimes we didn't have any choice. Those of us that were traumatized had physiological, instinctive, primitive responses to the feeling of overwhelming threat. You see, sometimes we hear this. We asked you, blah, 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 and you changed your mind, so therefore we think you're lying. I hear that a lot from teachers. And they're like, well, the person has got, what's the word they often use? They say they've got contradictory stories. Conflicting stories. I'm like, well, it's really difficult to remember aspects of your story when you've been traumatized. It's almost impossible. So we're recognizing here that trauma fragments memory. Because this part of our brain is offline, actually most of our memory goes into our limbic brain, and it's kind of like sucked up in fragments of visual and sensory memory. I've written in one of my books, when teachers confront traumatized children about their challenging behavior, it's fully possible due to the responses of the brain during trauma and stress that the child really doesn't remember what they did. Another one, I hear this a lot. I hear that people are told, well, you don't look sorry. You don't look like you're traumatized. You don't look like you're sad. You don't look like you went through a really difficult time. I've had somebody before told actually in a court case, well, you clearly don't look like you're upset by what's happened. And so I'm going to overrule that it didn't happen to you. And I'm there going, no. Negative affect is a trauma symptom. Getting to a place where your bucket is so full of bad stuff that's happened to you that you can't any longer show on your face you're overwhelmed. You've just gone into switch off. It's a dissociative response. Bruce Perry says, persisting physiological and emotional distress is physically exhausting and emotionally painful. Because of the pain, energy, and discomfort associated with the recurring intrusive thoughts and the physiological and emotional memories associated with these thoughts, a variety of protective avoidance mechanisms are used to escape the reminders of the original trauma. People shut down. They don't necessarily show on their face how distressed they are.